The Nectar of Devotion by Srila Rupa Goswami, translated by Srila Prabhupada. Chapter 7. Evidence regarding devotional principles. Just a short comment. In the previous chapter, so many regulative principles were given to guide our practical execution of devotional service. So here in this chapter, Rupa Goswami will give some scriptural references here in the next chapter and 2 or 3 more, detailing the scriptural basis for these regulative principles. They're not just arbitrary or whimsical. They're not just fashion, or neither are they cultural. They are eternal, based on the absolute truth. And that's why devotional service is actually beyond the 3 modes of material nature. So, the first one is accepting the shelter of a bona fide spiritual master. In the 11th Canto of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, 3rd chapter, verse 21, Prabuddha tells Mahārāj Nimi, "My dear king, please know for certain that in the material world there is no happiness. It is simply a mistake to think that there is happiness here, because this place is full of nothing but miserable conditions. Any person who is seriously desirous of achieving real happiness must seek out a bona fide spiritual master and take shelter of him by initiation. The qualification of a spiritual master is that he must have realized the conclusion of the scriptures by deliberation and arguments, and thus be able to convince others of these conclusions. Such great personalities who have taken shelter of the Supreme Godhead, leaving aside all material considerations, are to be understood as bona fide spiritual masters. Everyone should try to find such a bona fide spiritual master in order to fulfill his mission of life, which is to transfer himself to the plane of spiritual bliss." The purport is that one should not accept as a spiritual master someone who is fool number 1, who has no direction according to the scriptural injunctions, whose character is doubtful, who does not follow the principles of devotional service, or who has not conquered the influence of the 6 sense-gratifying agents. The 6 agents of sense gratification are the tongue, the genitals, the belly, anger, the mind, and words. Anyone who has practiced controlling these 6 is permitted to make disciples all over the world. To accept such a spiritual master is the crucial point for advancement in spiritual life. One who is fortunate enough to come under the shelter of a bona fide spiritual master is sure to traverse the path of spiritual salvation without any doubt. So, of course, this is the first and the most important regulative principle, without which all the other regulative principles are not going to have any effect. We often see in India especially people who pretend to be sadhus or pretend to be spiritual masters, but because they have no qualifications, not only their students, but even they themselves can't make any advancement. Advancement means that we actually realize for ourselves the great truths of the scriptures, such as Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam and Nectar of Devotion, and that we can pass these things on to others by explaining them properly. I can remember so many times when I first started studying this science of devotional service, reading something astonishing in the Shastra and going, wow, that's so far out. And now, 35 or 40 years later, this is like an ordinary everyday experience. The same thing. The same thing that I read and thinking, oh, this is really far out. Now this is the daily reality, the consciousness. So this is realization. If you don't get this kind of realization, it means there's something wrong. Either you're not following the principles properly, or you're not connected with a bona fide spiritual master, or you're making some offense. The next section. Accepting initiation from the spiritual master and receiving instructions from him. Sage Prabuddha continued to speak to the king as follows. My dear king, a disciple has to accept the spiritual master not only as spiritual master, but also as the representative of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the Supersoul. In other words, the disciple should accept the spiritual master as God, because he is the external manifestation of Krishna. This is confirmed in every scripture, and a disciple should accept the spiritual master as such. One should learn Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam seriously, and with all respect and veneration for the spiritual master. Hearing and speaking Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam is the religious process which elevates one to the platform of serving and loving the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The attitude of the disciple should be to satisfy the bona fide spiritual master. Then it will be very easy for him to understand spiritual knowledge. This is confirmed in the Vedas, and Rupa Goswami will further explain that for a person who has unflinching faith in God and the spiritual master, everything becomes revealed very easily. So this may be difficult for new students to accept. Certainly we don't demand that anybody accepts us as God. Quite the opposite. We ask that the students should examine the teaching very carefully, and they should inquire about all their doubts. Surprisingly enough, or not, actually it's not too surprising, the students tend to have the same or similar doubts, and we get the same or similar questions over and over and over again. So we have made every effort to put the answers to those questions in our course, in the approximate order that they usually pop up. And if you take our Bhakta course, you'll find that most of the questions that you'll come up with have actually been anticipated. But why do they say this? Why did they make this outrageous assertion that the spiritual master is the external manifestation of Krishna? Well, because the spiritual master, or the master teacher, is giving the same instructions as Krishna. Krishna is giving them internally in the form of the Supersoul, and the spiritual master is giving the same instructions externally, directly to the disciple. So the spiritual master is representing Krishna, but he is more accessible to the student than Krishna. So the student can approach the spiritual master with inquiries, whereas he can't do that in the beginning anyway, directly to Krishna. But over time, the student will also learn the means of contacting Krishna directly. That's the whole point. So if you've been chanting for some time and you still haven't felt this direct communication from Krishna, then you need to check yourself and see what's wrong. The best students are those whose attitude is one of wanting to satisfy the spiritual master. They make advancement much more quickly. Krishna reveals to them confidential things that he doesn't reveal to the more casual students. So if you really want to learn this transcendental science, then you have to take the proper attitude towards your spiritual master. And then Krishna will reveal very easily. The next section is serving the spiritual master with faith and confidence. Regarding accepting initiation from the spiritual master, in the 11th Canto of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, 17th chapter, verse 27, it is stated by Lord Krishna, "My dear Uddhava, the spiritual master must be accepted not only as my representative, but as my very self. He must never be considered on the same level with an ordinary human being. One should never be envious of the spiritual master as one may be envious of an ordinary man. The spiritual master should always be seen as the representative of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And by serving the spiritual master, one is able to serve all the demigods. How is that? Well, the spiritual master's purpose and Krishna's purpose are identical. Krishna creates the material universe as a place where the conditioned souls can go and live and pursue their independent sense gratification and like that. And then when they're ready or when they're tired of all this nonsense, they can learn the Vedic truths and go back home. So the spiritual master is giving those Vedic truths.